4, Chapter 1, The Forgotten Vault Door. Elena Rossi had always believed that the past was safest when it stayed on paper at 28. She was the youngest senior archivist ever hired by the Apostolic Vatican Library on a fixed-term contract. A detail that still made her father in Brooklyn choke on his espresso every time he said it out loud. She had flown into Fiumicino 3 days earlier, November 14th, 2025, dragging a single battered suitcase and the faint smell of jet fuel that never quite leaves your skin. The Vatican had put her up in a narrow guest house room on the Via di Porta Angelica, the kind of room where the crucifix above the bed looks down with the weary expression of someone who has seen too many temporary pilgrims come and go. Her assignment sounded, on paper, like the most boring 6 months of her professional life. Digitize 4,400 pages of wartime ration distribution logs from 1943-1945. Cross-reference them against the secret archives' sealed famine dossiers, and produce a sanitized PDF that would never see daylight outside the Holy See's servers. The kind of work that paid the rent and kept her mother from asking, yet again, when she was going to meet a nice Catholic boy and settle down. On her 4th morning, she followed the usual route through the Cortile della Pina, past the Swiss guards who now nodded at her like she belonged, down the spiral staircase that smelled of candle smoke and wet stone, until the fluorescent lights gave way to the low amber glow of the lower stacks. The air down here was colder than she expected for Rome in November. It carried a dry, papery scent at first, then something else underneath, something that reminded her of her grandmother's basement in Queens after Hurricane Sandy, damp cardboard, old flour, and the faint metallic sweetness of things quietly rotting. She was alone, as she preferred it. The other researchers worked topside under the frescoes. The sub-basements were reserved for people who didn't mind silence thick enough to chew. At 10:47 a.m., she reached the end of corridor 17B, a dead-end hallway no one had mentioned in the orientation packet. The wall should have been blank brick. Instead, set flush into the stone like it had always belonged there, was a steel door the color of dried blood. No handle, no plaque, only a hairline seam and, when she leaned closer, a faint dusting of pale gold across the threshold, grain dust. Not the ordinary flowery kind you find in a baker's apron, but coarser, almost sandy, the color of winter wheat just before harvest. Elena brushed her fingers over it. The dust clung to her skin like pollen. She took a photograph with her phone, more out of habit than suspicion. The flash revealed something else, etched into the steel, so shallow it might have been a trick of the light. The Latin words, granum devorat, the grain devours. She translated it automatically, the way other people read street signs. A voice behind her, soft, accented, almost amused. "You weren't meant to find that, Signorina Rossi." Father Marco stood at the mouth of the corridor, hands folded inside the sleeves of his black cassock, 45, maybe 50, tall, thin, the kind of thin that comes from too many missed meals and too many secrets. His eyes were the pale gray of winter skies over the Tiber. "I was cataloging the last shelf," Elena said, hearing how defensive she sounded. "The map ends here. The door isn't on any plan I've seen. Some doors prefer to remain off the plans." He stepped closer. "This level was sealed in 1946. Structural issues. You should return upstairs. The air is not good for lungs accustomed to American central heating. He didn't raise his voice, but the corridor suddenly felt narrower. Elena pocketed her phone. I just want to know what it is. It is a pantry, he said, too quickly. An emergency store from the war, empty now, forgotten, like many things down here. He smiled, but it didn't reach the eyes. She should have left then. Instead, she heard herself ask, why is there grain dust on the floor if it's been sealed for 80 years? Father Marco's smile thinned. Dust travels, Signorina, even in the house of God. He turned and walked away. His footsteps swallowed almost instantly by the stone. Elena waited until the sound was completely gone, then pulled a thin metal ruler from her document kit, the kind meant for measuring margins on brittle parchment. She slid it into the seam. The door sighed open 6 inches, just enough for a blade of darkness and a breath of air that smelled like 1,000 forgotten summers. She told herself she would only look. The room beyond was larger than it had any right to be. A cavern, really, carved out of the living tufa rock beneath the Vatican hill. The flashlight on her phone picked out the far wall first, a row of cylindrical metal silos, each 15 meters high, their surfaces scarred and dull with age. Ladders ran up their sides like veins. At the base of the nearest silo, a small mound of grain had spilled out decades ago and dried into a hard, amber wave frozen mid-collapse. The smell hit her then. Sun-baked fields, harvest festivals, her grandfather's stories of Calabria before the war, and underneath it all something sour, like milk left too long in the sun. Her beam swept upward, riveted to the silo wall, half obscured by dust, was the same Latin phrase, this time cut deep, granum deverat, and beneath it, almost invisible, a date, 27th, October 1943. Elena stepped inside. The door closed behind her with the patient finality of a confessional screen sliding shut. Total darkness. Then the emergency strips along the floor flickered once, twice, and died somewhere far above. The Vatican's entire power grid hiccuped. She found out later it was only a 3-second brownout caused by maintenance on the Belvedere transformer. But down here it felt eternal. She spun, clawing for the seam she had just opened. Her fingers found only smooth steel, no handle on the inside. Of course there wasn't. The silence was worse than any scream. It pressed against her eardrums like deep water. Then she heard the dripping, slow, rhythmic, from somewhere high inside the nearest silo. Plink, 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 like a faucet that would never be turned off. She raised her phone again. The flashlight came back, weaker now. In its cone of light, the grain dust on the floor began to move, not with wind, there was no wind, but in tiny eddies, as if something invisible were walking across it. The motes lifted, swirled, formed the brief outline of a handprint, then dissolved. Her breath fogged in front of her. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in 30 seconds. Plink, plink. Closer now. She backed up until her shoulders met the silo wall. The metal was warm, impossibly warm, as if something huge on the other side was breathing. She did the only thing she could think of. She screamed Father Marco's name. The sound bounced around the chamber, came back smaller, mocking. Minutes passed, or hours. She would never be sure. Then, without warning, The lights returned, not the emergency strips, but a single bare bulb high overhead, swaying on its cord like a hanged man turning slowly in the breeze. In its sickly yellow glow, she saw the door standing open again, exactly as she had left it. No one was there. She stumbled out into the corridor, slammed the door with both hands, and leaned against it, chest heaving. The air outside tasted like candle wax and salvation. Only when she reached the marble staircase did she feel the small, hard lump in the right pocket of her jeans. She fished it out under the first proper light, a single kernel of corn, golden, perfect, heavier than it should have been, that night, back in her room above the noisy Roman traffic. She placed the kernel on the wooden desk beneath the crucifix and tried to laugh it off. A souvenir, a prank, Vatican mice with a sense of humor. She fell asleep, fully dressed, shoes still on, the desk lamp burning. She woke at 3:33 a.m. to the smell of wet earth after rain. The kernel had split open, a pale green shoot, already 4 inches long, curled upward like a blind white worm seeking the sun. Tiny root hairs had wormed their way into the wood grain of the desk, burrowing, drinking. From the shoot hung a single drop of something darker than water. Plink. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Wheat. Elena Rossi did not sleep that night. Not truly. She lay on the narrow iron bed in her room above the Via di Porta Angelica, shoes still on, desk lamp burning like a vigil candle. The sprout from the single kernel had reached the ceiling by midnight, its pale leaves unfurled slowly, deliberately, brushing the plaster with the soft rasp of fingernails on a coffin lid. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the vault again, the impossible warmth of the silo wall against her shoulder blades, the way the darkness had pressed like a living thing. The single drop of amber sap that had fallen from the chute at 3:33 a.m. and landed on her wrist with the weight of a tear. She kept hearing her grandmother's voice from childhood summers in Calabria, Nonna Rosa, bent over the courtyard table shelling peas, telling stories of the war when the Germans took everything and the Vatican sent trucks in the night. They brought grain, Elena Mia, golden rivers of it, but some trucks never came back up from the tunnels. My cousin Gino drove one. He said the grain moved like it was breathing. Elena had been 8. She had laughed, stolen a handful of peas, and run to play in the olive trees. Now the memory tasted metallic, like blood under the tongue. At 5:47 a.m., she gave up, showered in water that never quite got hot, and dressed in the same jeans and black sweater she had worn the day before. The dust was still there, ground into the weave of the fabric, glittering faintly when the light hit it. She looked like she had been rolled in pale gold. By 6:30, she was outside the Casa Santa Marta, clutching 2 paper cups of espresso thick enough to stand a spoon in. The November air bit her cheeks, sharp with wood smoke from someone's illegal rooftop stove. Rome was waking, shutters clanging open, scooters coughing to life, the distant bronze voice of St. Peter's bell marking the hour. Normal sounds, safe sounds. Sister Lucia arrived wrapped in a charcoal wool coat 2 sizes too big, white veil tucked neatly beneath a gray scarf. Her face was the color of fresh parchment. She took the espresso with both hands as though it were communion. "You look like death, Elena." "Death would be an improvement," Elena said. "I brought you coffee so you can't say no." Lucia sipped, winced at the strength, and then, to Elena's surprise, laughed. A small, like startled sound like a bird taking flight inside a cathedral. Lead me to your demons. Then they walked in silence through the waking city, past the colonnade where tourists were already queuing for an audience that would not start for hours. The Swiss guards at the St. Anna gate recognized Elena now. One even lifted his halberd in a lazy salute. Underground. The corridors felt narrower than yesterday, the air heavier, as though the Vatican itself had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. Corridor 17B greeted them with the faint smell of incense and something sweeter beneath, overripe fruit, maybe, or flesh beginning to turn. The steel door stood ajar exactly 6 inches, the same gap Elena had forced with her ruler. A thin line of gold dust had been swept across the threshold sometime in the night, deliberate as salt against evil. Lucia crossed herself 3 times, rapid, practiced. Then she stepped over the line without hesitation. Inside, the vault had changed. The single bulb no longer swayed. It hung motionless. Yet the shadows moved anyway, sliding across the silos like oil on water. The temperature was warmer than body heat now, 33, 34 degrees Celsius, humid, almost tropical. Their breath no longer fogged. Instead, sweat sprang instantly at their hairlines. 12 silos, 12 iron giants, stamped with the faded eagle of the wartime regime and the quieter keys of St. Peter, AQ 1943, Acquisti Vaticano. The emergency stockpiles that had kept Rome from total starvation while the Allies bombed the rail lines and the Nazis stripped the countryside bare. Historians still fought over the numbers. Had Pius XII saved 100,000 lives? Or had he simply delayed the famine until it suited Vatican diplomacy? The grain had never been fully distributed. Some said rats got it. Others said something else had claimed it first. They walked between the towers. The floor was no longer concrete. Decades of tiny spills had created a crust of desiccated wheat, hard as amber, that crunched softly under their shoes, like thin ice over deep water. Lucia stopped beneath silo number 4. She tilted her head the way a child does when listening for the sea in a shell. Do you hear them? Elena heard only her own heartbeat, loud as a drum in a crypt. Then, beneath it, something else, a low choral murmur, rising and falling, the way the Roman crowds used to chant for bread outside the Palazzo Venezia, Latin, but wrong. The responses came half a beat too early, the intonation inverted, like a record played backwards at half speed. Lucia pressed her palm to the warm metal. Her veil brushed the surface and came away gilded. They're saying the rite of Leo Thetes, she whispered. The exorcism prayer. But they're the ones praying it at us. Elena felt the words crawl across her skin. She had read the rite once, late at night in graduate school, drunk on cheap Chianti and the thrill of forbidden texts. It was meant to cast out. Hearing it used as a lure felt like watching a crucifix turned upside down and still dripping holy water. Lucia's lips began to move, answering automatically, completing the Latin phrases the way one finishes a nursery rhyme started by someone else. Her eyes were wide, pupils blown huge in the dim light. Elena grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise. Stop, that's how it starts. The young nun blinked. came back to herself with a gasp. She stared at her own hand as if it belonged to a stranger. They climbed the access ladder, welded to Silo 4. The rungs were hot, 40 degrees, maybe more, slick with condensation. Halfway up, the metal vibrated faintly, a sub-audible thrumming that traveled through Elena's bones and settled behind her eyes like the start of a migraine. At the inspection hatch, they looked down into hell painted gold. The grain inside had sunk into a perfect vortex, a whirlpool 30 feet deep, its sides smooth as glass. At the bottom, pressed against the crust like fossils in amber, were shapes, human shapes, limbs folded at impossible angles, mouths stretched in eternal prayer. Their habits and work clothes had rotted away decades ago, leaving only pale skin marbled with veins of wheat. Some still wore the yellow stars the Nazis had forced on Roman Jews before the razzia of October 43. Their eyes were gone, replaced by swollen kernels that gleamed wetly. One of them, a boy, maybe 15, lifted his head. The movement was slow, dreamlike. He opened his mouth and spoke with Lucia's gentle mountain lilt. "Lucia, it's so dark down here. Come keep us company." The nun screamed, a small, sharp sound that shattered against the iron walls. She would have fallen if Elena hadn't locked an arm around her waist. They scrambled down the ladder so fast their palms blistered on the rungs, on the floor again. Lucia was shaking uncontrollably. She tore off her right glove with her teeth. In the thin crust of grain at the base of the silo was a handprint, fresh. The edges still crumbled inward, grains trickling like slow sand in an hourglass. The print was delicate, narrow, the exact size and shape of Lucia's own hand, down to the tiny crescent scar on the heel of the palm from when she had fallen off her bicycle chasing fireflies at 9 years old. Lucia stared at it until her knees buckled. Elena caught her before she hit the ground. From inside the silo came a new noise, a low, wet grinding, as though something enormous were turning over in its sleep. The temperature spiked again. The air thickened until every breath felt like inhaling soup. Lucia fumbled for the holy water in Elena's satchel. The instant her fingers closed around the small glass bottle, every light in the vault exploded in a chain of white sparks. Darkness swallowed them whole, absolute, ancient. In that darkness, the whispers became intimate, right against the shell of their ears, warm breath that smelled of sun-ripened fields and grave soil. "Stay," they said, in Lucia's own voice, soft, coaxing, loving. "Stay and feed us. You're so tired. Just lie down. The grain is soft, like the womb, like home." Elena felt her knees weaken. For one treacherous second, the idea seemed reasonable. Lie down, rest. Let the golden tide take her the way it had taken her grandmother's cousin, Gino, and all the others. Then she remembered Nonna Rosa's warning, spoken over peas and sunlight. Never trust anything that asks you to sleep. Elena mia, that's how the old hungers get in. She seized Lucia's hand and ran blind, counting steps the way she had once counted Hail Marys during her father's chemotherapy. 27, 28, 29, until her shoulder slammed into the steel door. It opened for them this time, swinging wide as if eager to spit them out. They fell into the corridor gasping, choking on clean cold air that tasted of candle smoke and salvation. Behind them, the door slammed shut with a clang that rang through every level of the secret archive like the closing of a tomb. Lucia was on her knees, veil askew, tears cutting silver tracks through the gold dust on her face. She looked up at Elena with eyes that had seen too much too young. "They knew my scar," she whispered. "They knew the exact day I got it. How do they know that?" Elena had no answer. She looked down at her own hands. The faint red lines she had noticed earlier had deepened into actual letters, raised and itching, Granum Deverat, etched into her skin like a brand that had been waiting 80 years to surface, somewhere far below. The grinding continued, patient, relentless, turning, and in the pocket of Elena's jeans, the single kernel she had forgotten to throw away pulsed once, warmly, like a second heart beginning to beat. Chapter 3: The Sunken Novice. The memo came at 5:47 a.m. on the 18th of November 2025, slid under Elena's door while the bells of St. Peter's were still clearing their bronze throats for the day. The envelope was heavy cream stock, the kind once used for papal briefs, sealed with scarlet wax bearing the crossed keys of the Holy See. Inside was a single sheet that felt disturbingly like skin. Routine structural integrity tour of sub-level storage facilities, 18th of November, 2025. Saturnindus. Practical demonstration of grain flow management protocols included. Attendance encouraged for all personnel with level 4 clearance or higher light protective clothing recommended. Office of the Fabric of St. Peter. No signature in the Vatican. That meant the order came from someone whose name alone could open or close the gates of paradise. Elena sat on the edge of her iron bed in the Casa Santa Marta and read it until the words bled together. She had not slept more than 90 consecutive minutes since the handprint. The letters carved into her palms had scabbed into perfect. Raised Latin, Granum Deverat. The scabs itched constantly, as though something beneath the skin was trying to push new letters through the healing flesh. She kept her hands wrapped in white archival cotton and told anyone who asked that it was a sudden allergy to 1943 paper. No one questioned an American with delicate skin. She showered in water that refused to run hot. Dressed in the same black jeans and black sweater she had worn for 5 days straight, and pulled on fresh gloves. The mirror showed her a woman who looked exhumed rather than woken, eyes ringed black, cheekbones sharp, lips bloodless. She whispered to her reflection, "You are not losing your mind." And the reflection, cruelly, did not answer. At 8:27 a.m., Father Marco materialized in the cafeteria without a sound, sliding into the plastic chair opposite her as though the seat had been waiting for him since the war. He looked carved from candle wax left too close to the flame, cheekbones sharp enough to slice prosciutto, eyes ringed violet, a faint rim of gold dust clinging to the cuffs of his cassock like pollen from a field that should not exist beneath Rome. "You saw the memo," he said. It was not a question. "I'm not going." "You are. We both are." His voice dropped until it was barely audible over the hiss of the espresso machine. Cardinal Ree's office has classified the grain as a heritage asset of incalculable spiritual and historical value. External contractors would require security clearances, non-disclosure agreements, and worst of all, questions. It is cheaper, cleaner, and infinitely more deniable to send one trusted soul inside with a shovel, a rope, and a blessing. He pushed a single sheet across the table, Standard Vatican Liability Waiver, Form VS 1943, Revenue 24. At the bottom, in Lucia's careful convent school handwriting, was her full name and the date, 17th of November, 2025, witnessed by the Mother Superior of the Ansel del Sacro Cuore. Elena felt the floor drop away. She volunteered. Marco's mouth twisted. Not quite a smile, not quite a grimace. She spent 6 hours in the chapel of San Lorenzo last night, on the stone floor, on her knees. She says the voices promised they would stop whispering if she came willingly. Just once. Just long enough to finish the prayer they started in October 1943 when the trucks never came back up. He drummed his fingers on the table, a nervous tick Elena had never seen before. She believes she can bargain with the dead. Elena, 22 years old, and she still thinks mercy is a currency. Elena stood so fast her chair scraped like a scream. We stopped this. We tried. I was in the governorate until 3 in the morning. They quoted Canon 129 on the preservation of sacred goods. They quoted Pius Thubernos's 1943 directive on emergency reserves. They quoted the budget. He spread his hands. Empty. We lost. They met the groups at 8:55 in the Cortile della Biblioteca. Beneath the indifferent gaze of the great bronze pine cone, 12 people in total, and every single one of them looked like they were walking to their own execution. 6 off-duty Swiss guards in civilian clothes, jeans, windbreakers, sneakers, trying to look like tourists and failing miserably. 2 engineers from the Fabbrica di San Pietro, Fabrizio and Matteo, both born within sight of the dome, both already sweating through their polo shirts. Luca, the photographer from L'Osservatore Romano, kept wiping his lens with a yellow cloth as though cleanliness could protect him. A silent Monsignor from the governorate, whose name no one dared ask. Father Marco, clutching a small black leather case that probably contained the 1614 Rituale Romanum and a flask of something stronger than holy water, and Sister Lucia Moretti. She stood very straight in a brand new white habit that looked almost luminous against the gray November sky. Her veil was crisp, her face serene, her eyes ancient. When she saw Elena, she smiled, a small, terrible smile that belonged on the face of a martyr walking into the Colosseum. I brought gifts, she said softly, and opened her canvas satchel. Inside lay a coil of new hemp rope, 3 centimeters thick, blessed by the Pope's chief exorcist at 3 a.m., a small crystal bottle of water from the River Jordan, stoppered with wax. An olive wood crucifix carved from a tree in Gethsemane, still fragrant after 2,000 years. Wrapped in purple silk, the actual 1946 relic stole of Saint Padre Pio, completed with the brown bloodstains from his stigmata that had never faded. Elena felt her throat close. Lucia, please. The novice touched Elena's cheek with cold fingers. We don't always get to choose how we answer the call. Elena, you opened the door. I have to walk through it. The descent took 23 minutes of rattling elevator and rising heat when the doors opened. The vault breathed on them, warm, humid, smelling of sun-ripened wheat and grave soil. Silo 4 waited at the far end, next to it. The test silo, 3 meters wide, 8 meters deep, filled to within 1.8 meters of the rim with fossilized 1943 grain. A narrow aluminum gangway crossed the top like a plank over hell. Fabrizio gave the safety briefing in bored Italian. Lucia raised her hand. I need to walk it, just a little way, to pray inside the wound. 5 minutes later, the rope was tied around her waist, the other end held by two Swiss guards. She stepped off the gangway. First step, soft, welcoming, ankle, calf, knee. Second step, the crust shattered, the grain rushed in with a wet, hungry sound, schluck, 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 swallowing her to the thighs. The rope snapped taut. Lucia's eyes flew wide. It's warm, like being held. Then the pull came, not gravity, intention. She dropped to the waist in a heartbeat. The habit billowed, collapsed. Grain poured over her shoulders, her chest, her throat. She never stopped praying, Latin tumbling frantic and perfect. The grain reached her armpits. Her free hand clawed the surface. Blood ran from her hairline. Elena screamed and lunged. Marco pinned her arms. Lucia's voice cracked. Faces. They're smiling. They say I taste like forgiveness. The wheat closed over her mouth, over her nose, over her eyes. Only her forehead and veil remained. A white island in a golden sea. Then that too vanished with a final, satisfied gulp. 3 seconds of silence. The rope began to saw sideways, violently. Pull, Marco roared. They hauled. Blood slicked the rope. Someone prayed in Romansh. Someone cried. Lucia came up choking, vomiting kernels and arterial red. They dragged her onto the gangway. She was alive. Her habit was soaked crimson from collar to hem, blood welling from dozens of small punctures, as though something with sharp fingernails had tried to keep her. She laughed, high and broken. They kissed me, said I'm the first bride since 1943, said the wheat is lonely. Marco knelt, pressed Padre Pio's stole to the wounds. Blood soaked the relic fresh. He began the full rite of exorcism. Lucia arched, a low, wet grinding coming from her throat, the same sound from the silos. Elena looked at Lucia's bare feet, grain dust up to the ankle, and in that dust, hundreds of tiny barefoot prints leading away from her body, up the ladder, into the darkness, as though an army of children had walked out of her skin while no one was looking. The rope around her waist was severed halfway through, fibers blooming like a deadly flower, and from the open hatch, something watched with eyes the color of ripe corn on a summer day that would never end. Chapter 4, Buried Secrets of 43. The day after Lucia was carried out of the vault on a stretcher, the Vatican sealed the entire level. Swiss guards in plain clothes stood at every stairwell. The freight elevator was locked with a new steel plate welded across the doors. A terse notice appeared on every internal bulletin board. Sub-level 17B closed for emergency structural reinforcement until further notice. All inquiries to the governorate. No one believed the excuse for a second, but no one dared ask questions either. Elena spent the night in the Vatican infirmary, sitting on a plastic chair beside Lucia's bed while machines beeped and dripped, and the young nun stared at the ceiling with eyes that no longer focused on this world. The punctures on her torso had been stitched, 47 in total, the doctor said, small and precise, like bird beaks or children's teeth. The blood tests came back impossible, elevated amylase, starch granules in the plasma, and something the lab tech refused to name out loud. At 3:14 a.m., Lucia spoke for the first time since the rescue. Her voice was soft, almost conversational, as though she were discussing the weather. "They're still hungry, Elena. They said one prayer wasn't enough. They want the whole Mass." Then she turned her head and vomited a single perfect kernel of corn onto the white sheet. The kernel rolled to the edge of the bed, fell to the floor, and began to sprout before Elena's eyes. A pale green shoot, unfurling like a blind worm seeking light. Father Marco arrived at dawn with 2 cappuccinos and a face the color of ash. He looks like he had aged 10 years overnight. "We have to go back," he said, "tonight. While the guards are changing shifts at 8, the Cardinal's office has scheduled a quiet extraction for tomorrow morning. Vacuum trucks, incinerators, the works. If we don't get answers before they burn it all, we never will." Elena stared at him. "You want to go back down there after what happened to Lucia?" "I want to finish what she started." His voice cracked on the last word. "She's dying, Elena, not from the wounds, from whatever they put inside her. The doctors can't explain the starch in her blood. The only way to save her is to understand what she bargained with." He placed a small flash drive on the table between them. "Last night I broke into the secret archives sealed section, the real one, not the tourist version. There are letters, Elena, from 1943, from the men who loaded those silos. They knew. They knew exactly what they were feeding." The flash drive contained 17 scanned pages, brittle, yellowed, written in frantic pencil on the back of ration cards. The handwriting belonged to a Vatican truck driver named Gino Moretti, Lucia's great-granduncle. Though she had never known his name, the letters were addressed to his sister in Calabria and never sent. 27 October 1943. "We loaded the last silo tonight. 12 in total. The Germans took everything else. But His Holiness kept these for the faithful. They made us work in silence, used no lamps after curfew. The grain came from the Ukraine. Black earth wheat, they called it. Heavy. Smelled like summer even in autumn. When we poured it in, it made a sound like breathing. I swear on the Madonna." It sighed. "Sabbath of November 1943, 2 men went missing, Jewish laborers from the ghetto. They said they fell in, but there were no screams, just the sound of the grain settling, like it was making room." November 1943. "I saw a hand tonight, pale, reaching up through the crust as we sealed Silo 4. It grabbed my ankle, cold. Then it let go and sank back down. The priest with us, Father L., made the sign of the cross and told us to forget. He said some things are buried for a reason." 15th of November, 1943. "The grain is moving on its own now. We hear it at night, grinding, like millstones. The priests come down with incense and holy water, but it only makes the smell sweeter, like bread baking in hell." The last letter was dated 27th of November, 1943, the day Gino Moretti vanished from all records. "They're calling us back tonight for one final load. I won't go. If you get this, tell Mama I love her. Tell her the wheat remembers every mouth it never fed." Marco closed the laptop. That's why Lucia heard her own name. It's been waiting for family. They went back at 1958, slipping past the guards with forged maintenance passes Marco had printed on the governorate's own printer. The new steel plate on the elevator had already been cut away. Someone else had been down there first. The vault was darker than before. The temporary lights had been smashed. Only the emergency strips glowed a sickly red, like the inside of a throat. The test silo where Lucia had sunk was sealed with yellow caution tape that fluttered in a breeze that had no source. The gangway was bent, twisted, as though something enormous had climbed out. Silo Four's hatch stood open. The grain inside had sunk another meter, forming a perfect spiral staircase descending into darkness. Marco handed Elena a harness, real climbing gear this time, not blessed rope. We go together. If one falls, the other pulls. No prayers, no bargaining. We get proof and we get out. They clipped in, checked carabiners twice, and started down the spiral of grain. The crust held their weight at first, hard as amber, warm as living flesh. Every step released a puff of gold dust that hung in the air like slow-motion fireflies. The smell was intoxicating. Fresh baked bread, sun on dry earth, a mother's kitchen on Sunday morning, 10 steps down. The whispers began again, not from the walls this time, but from beneath their feet. Welcome home, Gino. Elena froze. Marco's face went white. That's not for us, he whispered. Keep moving. 20 steps. The grain grew softer, almost liquid. Their boots sank to the ankle with every step. The harness lines creaked. 30 steps. The spiral widened into a chamber inside the silo itself, a pocket of air 20 meters across. The grain forming natural walls that gleamed like polished gold. In the center stood a circle of figures. They were human ones, 12 of them, arranged like the apostles at the Last Supper. Their bodies had been preserved perfectly by the dry, airless environment, skin leathery, eyes sunken kernels, mouths open in eternal prayer. They wore the clothes of 1943, a Vatican truck driver's overalls, a Jewish star sewn crookedly on a coat, a priest's cassock rotted to threads. Their hands were raised, palms up, as though waiting for communion that would never come. At the head of the circle sat Gino Moretti, or what was left of him. His skeleton was wrapped in grain husks, like a scarecrow. His skull tilted at an angle that suggested he had been looking up when the wheat finally closed over him. In his lap lay a small leather-bound book, the 1943 Vatican exorcist's diary, its pages swollen with moisture that should not exist 80 years underground. Marco approached first, harness line taut behind him. He opened the diary with shaking fingers. The last entry was written in blood that had never dried. They were never grain. They were the famine itself. We fed it bodies to keep it quiet. It is waking. It remembers every mouth it was denied. When it has 12 more, one for each silo, it will rise, and Rome will starve again. But this time, from the inside. Elena looked at the figures. Their mouths were moving, not sound, just the slow, patient opening and closing of jaws, long past screaming. One of them, the Jewish laborer with the crooked star, lifted his head. His eye sockets were filled with fresh, sprouting wheat. He looked straight at Elena and smiled with teeth made of kernels. Elena Rossi, he said, using Gino's voice. Your blood remembers Calabria. Your hunger is older than the church. The grain beneath their feet shifted, not a slide, a contraction. The circle of bodies began to sink, pulled downward by something vast moving below. The spiral staircase they had descended started to collapse. grain cascading in golden waterfalls. Marco grabbed the diary and ran. Elena followed, harness lines whipping behind them as the pocket chamber imploded. They climbed the collapsing spiral as it unraveled beneath them, grain pouring upward like a reverse avalanche. The whispers became a roar, thousands of voices speaking in Latin, Italian, Yiddish, Calabrese dialect, all saying the same thing: stay, feed us. The famine is eternal. They reached the hatch as the entire silo exhaled, a hot, sweet breath that smelled of bread and death. Marco shoved Elena out first, then dove after her as the grain erupted in a geyser that filled the vault to waist height in seconds. They lay gasping on the gangway, covered in gold dust that clung like guilt, in Marco's hand. The diary was already disintegrating, pages turning to wet pulp. Only one line remained legible, written in fresh blood that steamed in the cold air. The 12th apostle is coming. She tastes like forgiveness. From the infirmary, 3 levels above, came the sound of monitors flatlining in perfect unison. Lucia was gone, and somewhere in the darkness below, the grain began to sing. Chapter 5, The Devouring Mass, the night Lucia died. The grain started to sing in earnest. Elena heard it first from the infirmary corridor at 02:11 a.m. A low, wet, collective humming that rose through the marble floors like a hive waking under the Vatican. The monitors had flatlined in perfect unison at 02:07. The doctors called it catastrophic systemic amylolysis, starch dissolving organs from the inside. Elena called it payment. She and Marco didn't speak on the ride down. They no longer needed forged passes. The guards were gone. The new steel plate on the freight elevator had been torn away from the inside. The edges curled outward like petals of a metal flower. When the doors opened, the vault had become a throat. The emergency strips now glowed a deep, hungry amber. The temperature was 38 degrees and rising. The air tasted of fresh bread and funeral incense. Every silo door stood open. Grain had poured out in slow, deliberate rivers that met in the center of the chamber and formed a single golden lake, waist deep, breathing. Marco carried the harnesses. Elena carried Lucia's olive wood crucifix and the last page of the 1943 diary, the one that had survived disintegration. Sealed in a plastic evidence bag that was already fogging with condensation, they waded in. The grain welcomed them like warm flesh. It closed around their thighs with a lover's sigh, then tightened. The surface rippled in slow, peristaltic waves, as though something enormous were swallowing beneath, halfway across. The singing stopped. Silence fell so complete, Elena could hear her own blood. Then the grain spoke with Lucia's voice, soft, gentle, mountain sweet, coming from everywhere and nowhere. You came back. I knew you would. A hand broke the surface in front of them, small, delicate. Lucia's hand, still wearing the novice's silver ring. It reached for Elena, fingers opening and closing like a drowning child asking to be pulled up. Marco raised the crucifix. The hand hesitated, then sank. The lake convulsed. Grain erupted in pillars that solidified midair into human shapes, 12 of them. The apostles from Silo 4, now taller, is stretched, their mouths stretched wider than bone should allow. They moved without walking, gliding forward on roots of wheat that burst from their feet and burrowed back into the lake. The Jewish laborer with the crooked star stepped closest. His eye sockets were gardens now, green shoots waving gently in a wind that did not exist. She was number 11, he said in perfect Calabrese. We only need one more. Elena felt the grain climb her torso, warm and intimate, pressing against her ribs like a heartbeat not her own. Marco unslung the harness rope and looped it around both their waists. We burn it. Now. He pulled a road flare from his pocket, Vatican emergency kit, stolen from a Swiss Guard locker. He struck it. Crimson light flooded the chamber, painting everything the color of fresh blood. The apostles hissed and recoiled, shoots in their eyes curling like burning paper. Marco hurled the flare into the lake. For one perfect second, nothing happened. Then the grain caught fire. It burned gold, a cold, blue gold flame that did not consume but revealed. Every kernel ignited from within, turning the lake into a sea of tiny lanterns. In that light, Elena saw them all. Hundreds of bodies suspended just beneath the surface, perfectly preserved, mouths open in silent communion. Some wore 1943 clothes, some wore habits, some were children. The apostles screamed, a sound like a million dry throats swallowing at once. The lake began to drain, not downward, inward. A whirlpool formed in the center, slow at first, then faster, pulling everything toward a single point of absolute darkness. The apostles clawed at the surface, trying to stay above, but the grain itself betrayed them, dragging them down with loving arms. Marco and Elena were caught in the current. The harness rope snapped taut between them. Elena felt her feet leave the ground. The crucifix burned against her chest, like ice on fire. Marco's mouth moved. She couldn't hear over the roar, but she read the words, "Let go of me. Save yourself." She shook her head. The whirlpool spoke with 1,000 voices, braided into one. 12 for 12. The circle must be complete. Elena looked down. Lucia's body floated just beneath the surface, eyes open, smiling. Her habit had turned the color of ripe wheat. She raised one hand and pressed it against the underside of the golden membrane, directly under Elena's boot. A perfect handprint bloomed on the surface, fresh, warm, inviting. Elena understood. She unclipped her harness. Marco's scream was cut short as the rope went slack. She dropped. The grain closed over her head with the gentleness of a mother tucking in a child. Darkness, warmth, the smell of Sunday dinner in Calabria before the war. Then light, cold, white, surgical. She was standing in the center of the circle of apostles. They were whole again, beautiful, their eyes clear windows into summer fields that stretched forever. Lucia stood at her right hand, radiant in a habit woven from living wheat. "Welcome home, sister," Lucia whispered, and kissed her on both cheeks. The circle closed. 12 apostles, 12 silos, 12 mouths finally fed. Above, Marco's flare burned out. The lake settled. The vault fell silent. And somewhere far below, in the perfect darkness beneath Rome, the famine slept again, sated, patient, dreaming of the next hunger that would wake it. But one single kernel, small and golden and heavier than sin, rolled across the empty concrete floor, past Marco's abandoned harness, toward the open freight elevator. It left a trail of tiny green shoots behind it. They were already reaching for the city above. Chapter 6, Famine's Eternal Hunger. Marco never left the vault. He told himself he was waiting for Elena to surface. He told himself the flare had burned the evil out. He told himself a lot of things in the first hour. Pacing the bent gangway while the golden lake settled back into innocent-looking drifts and the emergency lights flickered like dying stars. By the third hour, he was sitting with his back against Silo 12, knees drawn up, whispering the names of every saint he could remember. The names tasted like ash. The grain had begun to creep again, slow, patient tendrils sliding across the concrete toward his boots, tasting the air with tiny green tongues. At dawn on the 19th of November, the Vatican announced that Sister Lucia Moretti had died peacefully of complications from a rare autoimmune disorder. The funeral would be private, donations to the Uncelle del Sacro Cuore in lieu of flowers. Marco laughed when he heard it on the cracked radio of an abandoned maintenance cart. The sound echoed wrong in the empty vault, too loud, too sane. He had not slept. He had not eaten. He had only watched the grain rearrange itself into perfect concentric circles around the spot where Elena vanished, like ripples frozen in time. On the second night, the singing returned, softer now, almost tender, a lullaby in a language that predated Latin, predated Italian, predated every tongue that had ever prayed for bread. Marco stood at the edge of the circle and spoke to the darkness. Take me instead. She was innocent. I'm the one who opened the diary. I'm the one who brought her down here the second time. The grain answered by parting. A path opened, narrow, golden, leading straight to the center where Elena had fallen. At the end of the path stood a single figure, Elena. She looked rested. Her archival gloves were gone. The scars on her palms had blossomed into living vines of wheat that wrapped around her wrists like bracelets. Her eyes were the color of summer fields at noon. She smiled the way Lucia had smiled the day she volunteered. Come, she said, and her voice was Elena's and not Elena's, layered underneath with 1,000 others. It's peaceful down here. No more questions. No more hunger. Marco took one step onto the path. The grain closed gently around his ankle, warm as fresh milk. He did not scream. He only whispered, "Forgive me," to the crucifix lying discarded on the gangway, and let the wheat take him home, above. Rome woke to an ordinary November Wednesday. Tourists queued for the dome. Priests said Mass. Delivery trucks brought bread to every bakery in Trastevere. No one noticed the tiny green shoots pushing up through the cracks in St. Peter's Square, reaching for the sun with blind, hungry faces. And beneath the city, in the perfect darkness that had waited 82 years for its 12th apostle, the famine finally slept, full for now, but hunger, like faith, is eternal, and one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe in another war, maybe when the next pope decides to open the old emergency stores, the grain will wake again. It always does, because some things are never truly buried. They're only waiting to be remembered. If you're ever in Rome and you smell fresh bread on a wind that has no source, walk the other way. The wheat remembers your name too. They sealed the vaults at dawn on 23rd of November 2025 with all the solemn, terrible ceremony the church reserves for burying its own mistakes. A full company of Swiss guards in parade dress formed a living wall along every staircase leading to sublevel 17B. Their halberds were lowered in perfect unison, points glinting like a forest of silver thorns under the emergency strips. Engineers in white hazmat suits worked in shifts, pumping liquid concrete laced with holy water from Lourdes, salt from the Dead Sea, and dust from the True Cross into the freight elevator shaft until the wet, sucking sound of cement became the only heartbeat left in the underworld. Cardinal Ray himself stood at the threshold in scarlet silk that looked, in the flickering red light, like fresh arterial spray. He signed the order in crimson ink, total entombment, no retrieval, no record, the grain. He declared to the cameras that were never allowed to film, would suffocate beneath 1,000,000 tons of Roman stone and be silenced forever. Rome believed him. The world believed him. Even the Pope, frail and trembling in his private chapel, believed him or wanted to believe him so badly that he ordered the bells of St. Peter's to ring a Te Deum of thanksgiving. They were all wrong that same evening. As the winter sun bled out over the Tiber and painted the dome the color of old blood, the Pope convened a secret consistory in the Pauline Chapel, the chapel Michelangelo had painted with the conversion of Saul, where the light of heaven strikes a man blind. Only 23 cardinals were summoned, the ones who still remembered how to pronounce the rite of absolute anathema, the prayer that severs a place from God's grace so completely that even demons fear to tread there. They wore scarlet watered silk that caught the candlelight and looked, for a terrible instant, like fresh blood. They carried the 1614 Rituale Romanum bound in human skin, the book no pope had opened since the Black Death. Their plan was ancient, desperate, and they prayed final. They formed a circle around the papal altar. The Pope, skeletal in white, raised the book with hands that shook like autumn leaves. The cardinals knelt. The air grew thick with incense and fear. In nomine Patris, the Pope began. The marble beneath the altar cracked. Not a small fissure, a wound. A single golden kernel pushed through the stone. Perfect, glistening, heavier than any seed had a right to be, then another, then 100. They rose in a slow, deliberate fountain, defying gravity, forming a woman's shape out of living wheat. Elena Rossi stepped from the column as though she had been poured from light itself. She was barefoot on the altar of St. Peter. Her archivist's clothes had been replaced by a robe woven from living stalks that moved with her breath like a second. Golden skin. The scars on her palms, once granum deverat, had blossomed into flowering crowns. Green shoots curling around her fingers like wedding rings offered by the earth itself. Her eyes were fields of ripe summer gold, and when she smiled, the basilica itself seemed to exhale a sigh of long delayed, terrible satisfaction. The cardinals froze. The Pope's mouth worked soundlessly, the book slipping from his fingers to clatter on the marble. Elena raised her arms. The dome answered. Michelangelo's frescoes began to weep grain. It rained from the finger of God touching Adam, from the eyes of the damned, from the very mouth of the Creator, a slow, golden waterfall that filled the nave to the rafters in minutes. The light turned amber, maternal, suffocating. The air filled with the smell of fresh-baked bread and grave soil, a scent so intimate it felt like remembering a childhood you never lived. The cardinals tried to run. The grain was faster. It surged across the marble in living rivers, ankle deep, knee deep, waist deep in heartbeats. Cardinals in priceless vestments thrashed and sank as though the floor had liquefied into quicksand. Their screams were muffled almost instantly, not by hands over mouths, but by kernels pouring between lips, filling throats with the taste of bread that had waited 82 years to be eaten. One cardinal, the youngest, barely 60, clawed at the air and managed 3 words before the wheat closed over his head. It remembers us. Elena walked through the chaos untouched. The grain parted for her like the Red Sea in reverse, forming a perfect isle of gold. She moved with the calm of someone who had already died and found the afterlife disappointing. Her bare feet left no prints. The wheat healed behind her as though she had never passed. She stopped beneath Bernini's baldacchino, the great bronze canopy supported by columns twisted like tormented souls, and looked up, high above, in the lantern of the dome, the Holy Spirit window shattered inward, not from force, from growth, a single wheat stalk, thick as a man's thigh, punched through the stained glass and began to descend, slow as a verdict, green leaves unfurling like banners of surrender. The stalk reached the suspended pope first. It wrapped around his ankles with the gentleness of a mother lifting a sleeping child, then tightened. He was hoisted higher, white robes billowing like a broken sail, until he hung upside down above the altar, exactly as St. Peter had hung on his cross. His mitre fell, rolled across the living grain, and was swallowed without a ripple. The Pope found his voice at last. Exorcissimus te, omnis immundus spiritus, he began, voice cracking like dry bread. The stalk opened, not a mouth. A harvest, kernels poured into the Pope's screaming mouth, down his throat, filling him from the inside out. His belly swelled, skin stretching translucent, until the outline of individual kernels showed beneath like coins under silk. Veins of green spread across his face as shoots pushed through his cheeks, his ears, the corners of his eyes. His final sound was not a prayer, but a sigh, the sigh of a man who had spent his life feeding others and was now, at last, being fed. Then, with a sound like ripe fruit splitting in perfect silence, he burst, not in blood, in grain, a golden explosion that rained down on the remaining cardinals, like manna from hell, where each kernel touched flesh. New shoots erupted instantly, from nostrils, from fingernails, from the whites of eyes. The chapel became a greenhouse of screaming saints. Elena never flinched. She continued to the high altar, where the relic of St. Peter's chains lay beneath bulletproof glass. The grain had already reached it. The chains were rusting, flaking away, replaced by living vines that wrapped around the bones of the first pope and lifted them gently, reverently, into the air. The bones began to sing, not with voices, with memory, every prayer ever offered at this altar, every confession whispered in terror, every tear shed for sins too heavy to carry, all of it poured out in a chorus of wheat rustling in wind that had never blown inside these walls. The sound was beautiful. It was unbearable. Elena closed her eyes and listened. She saw Gino Moretti's last breath in 1943, the way he had looked up at the silo roof and whispered his mother's name before the grain took him. She saw Lucia's final smile in the infirmary as the wheat kissed her goodbye, promising a garden where no one ever went hungry again. She saw Marco on his knees in the square, roots bursting from his eyes like tears he could never shed, begging forgiveness for the diary he had opened. She saw the future, Rome starving again, not from bombs this time, but from within, bread turning to living grain in bakeries overnight, communion hosts sprouting in priests' hands during Mass, the body of Christ becoming literal stalks that pierced palms like stigmata, children waking with kernels under their tongues, dreaming of fields that stretched to the edge of the world and whispered their names in voices that sounded exactly like their mothers. She understood the bargain completely now. 12 apostles for 12 silos, 12 sacrifices to feed the famine forever. She was the 12th. The grain rose to her chest, her throat, her chin. It was gentle, almost loving, whispering in 1,000 voices. Her mother's, Lucia's, Marco's, Gino's, the Pope's last gurgle, promising peace, promising an end to questions, promising the kind of sleep that lasts until the next hunger. Elena closed her eyes. The last thing she felt was Lucia's olive wood crucifix pressing against her heart like a seed refusing to sprout. Then the wheat closed over her head. Silence, absolute, golden silence that lasted exactly 7 heartbeats. Then the basilica exhaled. Every door burst open at once. Grain poured out in a tidal wave that swept across St. Peter's Square, swallowing tourists, priests, pigeons, memories. The obelisk cracked down the middle and fell, swallowed whole. The fountains ran gold, and from the highest point of the dome, a single stalk rose, thick as an oak, crowned with a single ear of wheat the size of a man. It bent toward the city. It opened. Kernels rained on Rome like judgment, not destruction, invitation, because the famine had kept its promise. It had waited for the 12th sacrifice, and now it was full enough to share. One kernel landed on a baker's windowsill in Trastevere, one in a child's pocket in Testaccio, one in the Pope's empty chair. They sprouted before sunrise. By noon, the city smelled of bread baking in ovens that had been cold for hours. By dusk, the streets were rivers of gold. By midnight, the singing had reached the catacombs, the Colosseum, the Pantheon. And somewhere, in the perfect darkness that had once been the papal vaults, 12 new silos began to form, not of iron this time, but of living bone and memory, waiting, patient, eternal, because hunger, like faith, never truly dies. It only changes form and waits for the next mouth brave enough to say grace. If you're watching this at night, check your kitchen, check your bread, check the corners of your mouth when you wake tasting summer in winter, because the 12th sacrifice is complete. But the harvest has only just begun, and the wheat remembers your name too.